Everybody, thanks so much for listening to Fire Breathing Rob. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, thanks so much. Spotify, Google Podcasts, and or any other place. We also appreciate YouTube. And if you're listening to us on the radio, thanks so much. If you're listening to us on the podcast circuit or on YouTube, definitely subscribe, like, and share this interview. It's with a man that has a very vast knowledge of American politics. And I'm excited to have him on because I remember watching him back in college talking about the Obama-Hillary primary race and even the Obama election. So for people that don't know, this is Bill Schneider. He is a former CNN affiliate. Bill Schneider, thanks so much for your time. I'm excited for this.
My pleasure to be with you.
The people that don't know you, can you give a quick insight about you?
Well, let's see. I am both a journalist and an academic. I started my career getting a PhD in political science and teaching. I liked teaching. I didn't like political science so much. So I was invited to start writing for a newspaper, and I did. And I decided that that was the audience I really wanted to reach, a general audience rather than an audience of narrow specialists. So I wrote for the Los Angeles Times for many years. Then I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly. I did a series of cover stories for them, some of which were very well received. I did a piece back in 1990 called The Suburban Century Begins, about the fact that for the first time in history, a majority of Americans live in suburbs. That started with the 1990 census. Now it's a clear majority and had a lot to do with Biden's victory over Donald Trump. Those suburban voters shifted from Trump to Biden, and I can explain why, but it's a little complicated, but I won't do it right now. But then I was asked by CNN to become a political analyst. I remember I asked CNN, what is a political analyst? And they said, well, we have reporters who go out and recover what's going on, and we have analysts who explain what it means, and then we have commentators who say, like Jesse Jackson, this is what I think. And they told me, no one cares what you think. We just want you to explain what's going on. So I did that for about 20 years, retired from CNN about, 12 years ago, and then have been teaching at George Mason University. And one thing you didn't mention is I am now currently, as of about a month ago, retired. I'm Professor Emeritus at George Mason University. And when I was granted that title, I asked a colleague, what exactly does that mean? He said, nice title, no paychecks.
For the people that are listening that do want to get into radio, TV, can you tell the viewers a little bit about your journey through being a reporter and then being on CNN and basically a day in the life, if you want to even say something like that?
Well, what you have to do is learn how to be concise, particularly in television or radio. People don't want to hear. In academia, conciseness is distrusted. In journalism, and particularly in television, it's rewarded, it's valued. So you have to learn how to boil your thoughts down very, very quickly to one or two sentences. That takes a lot of work. Actually, I was first trained to be on television. Nobody knew this at CNN when they hired me. I was trained in England. I covered American politics for a while for London Weekend Television, which doesn't even exist anymore. But I used to go over there, and whenever they had a show dealing with the United States, I would comment on it and explain it to my British listeners. So the key factor in journalism is to be clear and concise, which is not always what academia is about. Academia is a little bit different.
I want to talk about fake news because the president's really, well, I should say, we'll rewind that because it is the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, who really put that song and dance into effect back in 2015 when he started his campaign for president of the United States. How has that really hurt, the way that, you or I really see the media in general? Because I talk to a lot of people and they say, hey, I don't trust CNN. I don't trust MSNBC. It's all liberal talk. And I don't trust Fox News because they're conservative. So do you feel like that's been coming on for a while and Donald Trump just really put it in the mainstream? Or is this something that, really just started with Trump?
No, it actually started a long time ago,
Okay.
and it started mostly on the right. Conservatives have for decades been distrustful of the media because they believe that the media is run by liberals. I remember in 1964, the San Francisco Convention of Democrats, the Republican convention that nominated Barry Goldwater.
Mm.
Um, One of the key speakers was Dwight Eisenhower, and he attacked sensation-seeking columnists for the national press. And there was a huge roar in the crowd. This had never happened before. But a speaker at a National Party convention, a conservative convention, attacked the press. And no one had ever heard anything like that happen in the past. And that became an increasingly powerful theme among conservatives, to the point now where just about all conservatives believe that the press is controlled by liberals. And of course, in the 90s, a very entrepreneurial fellow named, what's his name? Roger Ailes.
Mm.
He started Fox News because he realized there's an audience out there that doesn't just want to hear the news. They want to hear the news delivered from a point of view that they can identify with. There is such an audience. It was conservative. They objected to what they thought was the liberal bias of the press. And they've become now the most widely watched television news program on cable TV.
Bill Schneider here on Fire Breathing Rob. Definitely check him out. Are you worried for the mainstream media in general, where there's a lot less people watching now, especially with Trump out of the presidency, and a lot of people are really going into this independent news media now? So I feel like along with that and cutting the cord, it's really going to hurt mainstream media in general. But it's also, there's going to be a lot of that disinformation going around on the internet, like there has been with QAnon.
You're quite right. That's become an increasing problem with the press. Today, to succeed in the press as an analyst or a commentator, you're supposed to have a clear partisan or ideological point of view. That way you cultivate an audience. And that's become a bigger and bigger issue. People want their news from a point of view. And I'm not sure that's always good. What happens is that you do have an audience that just wants straight news, straight information, but it's a small audience, and it tends to be a very well-educated audience. Those are people who do read the New York Times or the Washington Post. Very few people read newspapers. I taught a course in journalism once, and I asked the students, in journalism, how many of you read a daily newspaper? 1 or 2 out of 30 students raised their hands and said they did. I said, how do you get your news? And they said, we get news from Facebook. I don't know how you get news from Facebook, but they say that's how they got their news. Well, the fact is the news business has changed dramatically. People prefer now to get news from a point of view. The audience for information and analysis, the straightforward news audience, is still there. And it's very well educated. It's very sophisticated, but it is small. And it's hard to make a lot of money in that business the way that was very prominent, say, 30 or 40 years ago. But it is a problem. People don't. I read 4 newspapers a day. My father used to read 2 or 3 newspapers a day. But very few students, very few people read newspapers anymore. They look at the news on television. They look at their phones. It's just a different universe. And the other big change is that news has become far more partisan, more ideological than it ever was in the past. Every news source is identified as either liberal or conservative, and that's contributed to this very damaging and dangerous polarization of the country. I mean, you know, about a third of Americans expect there could be another civil war in this country between liberals and conservatives. I think that's very unlikely, but the fact is people are just that divided. I had a student once who raised his hand and said, is this the most divided we've ever been as a country? And I said, you know, young man, we once had a civil war. 750,000 Americans died during the Civil War. We're not there, but this is the most divided we've been since that terrible time.
We saw this after the Telecommunications Act. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this information, but that's what I was told back when Clinton was president with the Telecommunications Act. There was these conservative companies that were buying up thousands of newspapers, thousands of radio stations and TV stations. And, you know, that's who they're catering to. So people are getting all this conservative news now, I feel like, because all these newspapers and TV stations are owned by conservative bigwigs in plain English.
Like Sinclair. Yes, that is true. And that's a lot of local news outlets and local television stations have a definite point of view, which they're willing to use in their news reports. That is a problem, and it's creating the polarization. It's contributing to the polarization of our politics and our lives. I mean, everything in America is polarized. Look at the vaccination rates.
Yeah.
Republicans are not, until the New York Times said now even Republicans are starting to get vaccinated because they're scared. But the fact is, all news is now filtered through a partisan agenda. Everything is partisan in the United States.
Well, the vaccine thing was Trump was running around in every rally saying it's a joke, it's the Wuhan virus, it's the China virus,
But he
it's
got
just the
vaccinated.
flu. Yeah, and then he gets vaccinated, but he won't come out and put a public service announcement and tell the people to get vaccinated. It's really sad because he really, I think, was the kingpin. You go back to, and you remember this because you were covering all this stuff back to 2012 when he was thinking about running for president, when even Sarah Palin before that was calling Obama Muslim. Trump got in on that too. So I agree. It's been going on for a while, but these people like Palin and Trump are really playing off this racist white working class. And these people have been getting screwed left and right, and they don't believe in anything anymore. But they have Trump who's saying all this BS, and they start to believe stuff because they're kind of just fed up with the whole system at all. So they're believing in all this stuff that Trump's saying, all this QAnon stuff, January 6th. It's really sad because I think our country, even the educated people are believing in this bill. You had people in January 6th that were doctors and lawyers that were up there. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, and it has become a bigger and bigger problem. And it's affecting the way the media covers things. I mean, you're quite right. The polarization has increased. Let me tell you where we are now in American politics.
Mhm.
It's kind of interesting. It's been true for about 100 years, and it remains true. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be a Republican.
Right.
Very wealthy people tend to still vote Republican. On the other hand, and this is what's new, the better educated you are, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. So I usually have a student who raises his or her hand and says, what if you're wealthy and well educated? Both. And I say, then you are what sociologists call cross-pressured. You're pulled in different directions. If you vote your economic interests, you're going to vote Republican. If you vote your cultural values, you're going to vote Democratic. So what happened last year was that lots of suburban voters who are wealthy and well-educated, white suburban voters, could no longer stomach Donald Trump. He offended their values. They didn't like the fact that he lied all the time, that he said things that weren't true. So what they did was they streamed out of the Republican Party and supported Joe Biden. Whether they're going to stay there, I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this, though. I personally believe if Donald Trump actually acted like George W. Bush did after 9/11, when the Twin Towers came down, and you remember this, I'm sure you covered this.
Yes.
He went down to ground zero. He said, we're going to kill the terrorists. We're coming after you. The country united. Everybody had that American flag outside or on their car, and they were driving with it. If Trump said, he went on the stage of the White House and said, listen, he said, we're going to defeat the virus. We're going to come together. We're going to get this vaccine. He would have won re-election in a landslide, even if the BS that he says and all the stupidity he does. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think he lost an opportunity. I remember I discussed this with my class when I was teaching. The pandemic defeated Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't handle it. And he did what he did with every issue. He turned it into a divisive issue. The thing that people object to most about Donald Trump is he treats everything as a cause of division. Every issue becomes us versus them, the Trump followers versus the Trump critics. Everything is divisive, and Americans don't appreciate someone who deliberately divides them and divides the country. That's precisely what Donald Trump did, and that's one reason why he lost so many votes. Well, he actually gained votes in 2020, but he lost a lot as well.
Bill, can we go back to, because we have a lot of people that do like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and there was times, and I listened to a lot of book tapes, and I listened to two of the books that came out about that election as far as the Democratic primary, and also the Lucky book that came out about Joe Biden already. And there was talks that Bernie Sanders was actually on his way. And I remember this very vividly in 2020. You know, the Iowa thing got bungled. He went and he won New Hampshire very slightly over Buttigieg by 3 points, but then he smoked Nevada. What do you feel like happened with the Sanders campaign where they bungled South Carolina and then they went on to Super Tuesday where Joe Biden did get a lot of that free media coverage after winning South Carolina, and then obviously Klobuchar drops out, Beto O'Rourke drops out and endorses, and Pete Buttigieg does too. And I think also with the Elizabeth Warren not dropping out of the Super Tuesday really hurt Bernie Sanders also. Do you agree with any of that? Or if so, if not, what is your synopsis on what happened with Bernie Sanders in the 2020 campaign?
What happened was blacks. Blacks determined the Biden nomination. In South Carolina, the critical moment of 2020 in the Democratic primaries was when Jim Clyburn, the senior black caucus member in the House, endorsed Joe Biden. Blacks are a powerful constituency in the Democratic Party, and they're a majority of South Carolina Democratic primary voters. Well, when Biden got the black vote, he got the support of Clyburn and carried it overwhelmingly in South Carolina. That was a signal to black voters nationwide. Here is your man. Why did black voters gather behind Joe Biden? For a very simple reason. More than any other constituency in this country, black voters, African Americans, were desperate to defeat Donald Trump. They wanted him out of office because he's a racist, and they just wanted him gone. And they saw Joe Biden as the candidate most likely to defeat Donald Trump because Joe Biden represented and still represents something very valuable to Americans. He's normal. Donald Trump is anything but normal. People wanted normal politics, and they saw an opportunity to do that by supporting Joe Biden, not the candidates who would be riskier and might not beat Trump, like like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
But do you feel like, and going back to 2020 with Bernie, I feel like he made a mistake on 60 Minutes where he kind of bungled it and he went into that Cuba song and dance about Castro, which was true because that's actually what Obama did, but that's par for the course now, what he was saying. I believe he should have said to Anderson Cooper, said, Anderson, look, I know a lot of people have heard a lot about me and democratic socialism, but here's where I'm for. Medicare for all, and then explain the stuff. Do you feel like that was the bungle? Because I remember this. I was watching MSNBC that night, and Chris Matthews and everybody on that station was having a conniption fit because Bernie Sanders won that primary by like about 30 or 40 points. And it looked like, hey, he's going to lose in South Carolina by maybe 20 points. But they had all these big, huge leads in these Super Tuesday states. Says, hey, we'll be fine. We're going to win California. We're going to win Vermont. We're going to win Colorado and win out in Washington, which I believe he lost, and Massachusetts, which he lost. But a lot of that was because Elizabeth Warren split that vote. You don't agree with that?
Well, yeah, there was a division among liberals because there were several liberal candidates. But the fact is, Joe Biden had an issue. The issue was normalcy. He was a normal guy. He was a likable guy. Democrats were very concerned, particularly black Democrats, that if they nominated someone on the left, like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, it wasn't any single mistake. But if they nominated someone who was easily identifiable as a leftist, and Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist, a democratic socialist, that it would be impossible to defeat Donald Trump. And these were voters who were desperate to get rid of Donald Trump. Black voters had a lot at stake in that election. And so they went for the candidate who had the best chance of beating Donald Trump. And he did.
Agreed. As we move on with the last few questions, because I do want to get into your articles, but the last few questions, I want to know this because I try to ask, politicos that I've had on. We had Tom Steyer, I asked him, I asked Lincoln Chafee this also. And I want to get your opinion on this, Bill. Why do you think that America voted for Donald Trump in the first place back in 2016?
Oh, I can answer that because I covered that campaign. I went all over the country just before the 2016 election, and I did focus groups for a newspaper, and I would meet with voters. And I remember I met with Democratic voters in a number of states, and the focus group I remember most distinctly was in Arizona, but I heard this all over the country. Democrats would always say, I don't really trust Hillary Clinton. I don't really like her. She wasn't very popular. She's been around too long, and she's not my kind of Democrat. I don't like her. And I said, are you going to vote for her? And they said, well, you know what? She doesn't need my vote. They all said that because the polls indicated for certain that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So I kept hearing Democrats say over and over and over again, she doesn't need my vote. And I don't really like her or trust her. And a lot of Democrats just stayed home. That's why she lost. That's why we had that big surprise. That's why Trump, he didn't win the popular vote, but that's why he won the electoral vote, because so many Democrats just said, you know, she doesn't need my vote. That is what destroyed her.
So what is your opinion then when the mainstream media comes back and they blame it on Russia, they blame it on Bernie Sanders, they blame it on Jim Comey?
Well, partly is the fact that people didn't trust Hillary Clinton, as I just said. Uh, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure why, but she had been around a long time. A lot of it was distrust of her husband,
Mhm.
and you know that really was the key factor. There's also something else. She made a mistake that a lot of Democrats make. I argue that the occupational hazard of Democrats in politics is condescension.
Hmm.
Obama exhibited condescension when he talked about small town voters in
Yep.
Pennsylvania who cling to guns and religion. Hillary Clinton committed condescension when she called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. That kind of condescension really angers and irritates voters on all sides, but particularly Republicans and conservatives. When Democrats are condescending, why are they condescending? Because on the whole these days, Democrats are more likely to have college degrees, more likely to be well educated, and they often look down their noses at Republicans, at the Sarah Palins of the world, and make fun of them, at Donald Trump, even though he has an Ivy League degree. The fact is, they look down their noses and they say they're stupid, they're ill-informed, they're uneducated. Look, the Trump people aren't even getting vaccinated because they don't trust experts. That kind of condescension is fatal for Democrats, and that's what Hillary Clinton was penalized for.
So I want to go into Biden first. Before we go into your article, what grade would you give Biden so far?
Oh, I think he's doing fine. I think I wouldn't give him an A plus. He's not a inspiring figure. He's not a charismatic figure, but he's doing what he was expected to do. He's carrying on like a president should. He has an ambitious program. He's much more progressive than anyone expected.
Mhm.
Right now, his program may be in trouble because the second wave of pandemic infections is becoming the top of the news, and his infrastructure program may be held up. It doesn't look like it's going to get passed by this Congress, but it's going to be, and it is a problem. I think Biden gets a solid A minus, B plus grade.
Okay. Why does Biden keep trying to push these bipartisan proposals instead of just saying we got 50 Democrats, put the axe into Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and say, you're going to vote for this or we're going to run a primary against you guys?
That's what a lot of Democrats are asking right now. Why does Joe Biden pretend that bipartisanship is even possible? It is not possible in the current environment. But here's the reason why he does it. Joe Biden is an old-fashioned Democrat. He was formed in the Democratic Party of the 50s and 60s, and he first entered politics in the 1970s. The old idea of politics is bipartisanship is good. The parties are led by moderates. They try to get along with each other. That was true in the 50s and even for a while in the 60s. But starting in the late 60s, when everything became torn apart and divided, you found the parties beginning to move farther and farther apart, particularly when Ronald Reagan was elected. So that bipartisanship today, I call it a chimera, a beast. Biden is chasing a chimera, with the head of a lion and the body of a goat or something. It doesn't exist, which is the best argument for getting rid of the filibuster. You can't invent bipartisanship by requiring it to pass any legislation. In an era where bipartisanship is dead, and I would agree with you, bipartisanship is dead. It'll be impossible to pass anything if you require bipartisan support. Biden is learning that lesson right now.
But well, technically, he should have learned it a long time ago. Because again, he was in the Obama administration. They couldn't get anything done. They couldn't even get Merrick Garland in. But sorry, it gets me really frustrated because there's so many big things, and goes into the next question. America wants people in Congress and U.S. senators, the congressmen and women, to get big things done. They don't care if it's bipartisan or not. Why
That's right.
don't these people have this in their heads to say, it's what have you done for me lately? Not, oh, I can't get it done because the Republicans in power. This goes back to Obama 2008. Okay, we gave you the Senate, we gave you the House, we gave you the presidency, we gave you super majorities, and you guys can't get half of this stuff done. It gets passed, and they have these people in the U.S. Senate that drag their feet, and then we got to go back and forth. It's sickening.
Well, you make a good point, but let me remind you, Obama did get one important thing done: healthcare reform.
He did,
The most
yes.
important reform of any administration since the 1930s. Healthcare reform, certainly since Medicare in the 1960s. He got that done wholly with Democratic votes. Not a single Republican voted for the healthcare proposal. And there was a lesson there. If you want to get things done today, you have to do things on a partisan basis. You have to vote for the party you like, and you have to give them a majority, and they have to pass their agenda. This is normal in most countries in the world. In a country like England, where you have a parliamentary majority, nobody expects bipartisanship. But in the United States, we have a constitutional system that makes it very hard to pass things. It means you have to have a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise. Parties just can't march in and pass their agenda the way they can in other parliamentary countries. So the result is that it's not natural for Americans to do things on a partisan basis, but it's the only way now that things can get done. Obamacare proves it. It's the biggest thing that's gotten done in this country probably in the past 20 years. And it got done wholly on a partisan basis. And for that matter, Trump's tax cut, which Republicans treat as sacrosanct, that didn't get a single Democratic vote either. Right. That got done on a partisan basis. That's how you have to get things done in the United States, which means that we're becoming more like a parliamentary democracy, like Britain or France.
So what's going to happen, Bill, with the infrastructure bill? Because right now it's bipartisan. Do you think it will get passed? Because it's going to be really hard if they don't get this passed in the next year and a half. Because once those elections come, I personally believe it's going to be extremely hard for the Democrats to keep the House because of the redistricting and that obviously with the census. It's extremely hard.
It's going to be hard for the Democrats to keep both the House and the Senate. The odds are very poor for Democrats to be able to retain both of them. Just look at the record. A midterm is almost always bad for a president's party. It takes something extraordinary for a president's party to win seats to gain seats in a midterm. One of the things that did that was 9/11. After 9/11, the Republicans gained seats in 2002, but 9/11 was a pretty dramatic event. No, it's going to be very difficult. That's the only way things can get done today. They have to get done on a partisan basis because we have a constitutional system that was designed to make it very hard to pass legislation. You have two houses of Congress. You have divisions. You have the states versus the federal government. You have all kinds of divided authority in this country, unlike other countries. And that means that things historically have been done through negotiation and compromise. That's what Biden knows. He came up in the Senate when everything was done through negotiation and compromise. That's becoming more and more difficult. He was in the Obama administration. You're quite right. He should have learned the lesson then. But I fear that he's much more of a Tip O'Neill and maybe even Franklin Roosevelt kind of Democrat. He's a very traditional-minded Democrat.
Well, it's just not even that, Bill. It's that half of these senators that he was in the Senate with are gone, or they're dead, or they're gone in general. So, I mean, come on, man.
And the newer senators are people who have a very rigid ideological point of view on both sides, really.
Right. Last question about the American Families Plan came out at 3.5 trillion. Bernie Sanders did have a huge part in negotiating that. The question is, what is going to happen with Joe Manchin? From what I hear, Chuck Schumer's behind that plan. Joe Biden is behind that 3.5 trillion plan. Is that going to get passed also, or will it get lowered, or will it just get kaput?
And the only way it'll get passed is if it gets passed with a simple partisan majority,
Mhm.
which doesn't sound so shocking. I remember when Obamacare passed, Nancy Pelosi said it passed because the majority passed it. Is that so radical? The majority rules. That's a very traditional principle, and the American Families Plan can pass the same way. There's a difference between the bipartisan infrastructure plan and the American Families Plan. Let me explain the difference. Infrastructure is public works spending. Public works spending is spending on programs that are available to everyone, like roads, like bridges, like good schools, like good highways. Those are things that everyone can use and everyone appreciates. And they're really beyond controversy. Both parties support them. Social welfare programs, which is what the American Families Plan is about, those are about spending money on things that most people can provide for themselves, like healthcare, like food, like housing. Those are things that middle class people can provide for themselves, but some people cannot. And
Mm.
so the government steps in starting in the 1930s and said, we're going to help people who can't provide those things for themselves. That's what the American Families Plan is all about. Republicans oppose those. That kind of spending, social welfare spending, is very controversial. Public works spending is not usually very controversial, which is why the failure to pass the public works bill would be really shocking.
I know you said the Democrats are going to lose the House and the Senate. The Democrats do have some good things on their plate, though, that they can bring to the voters. They have the child tax credit. That is huge for people, middle
Yes.
class and poor. That's money in these people's pockets. And I know Joe Biden just did a rally in Virginia for Terry McAuliffe, and he's going around the country. He needs to keep doing that. Kamala Harris should be out doing that consistently to make sure that gets talked about as much as it does. And there's also obviously people are getting vaccinated, Delta variant. There's nothing the Biden administration can really do about that. He's doing his best. So as you said at the beginning, Bill, I think Biden's doing as good as he can. I do think the Democrats will lose seats, but I think they don't have to be the 2010 Democratic Party where they get wiped out. Do you agree with that?
I agree. First of all, I did not predict the Democrats would lose the House and Senate. I just said there's a reasonable
Mhm.
chance that could happen. It
Right.
would be remarkable if it doesn't happen, but it could happen. I'm not predicting anything.
Okay.
Everything depends on the Biden record, how things are going. And right now, things are going pretty well. There's a lot of concern about inflation.
Yeah.
There's this amazing situation where jobs are going and no one will take them. I mean, camps are closing because they can't find camp counselors. It's just astonishing. But the Biden record will determine exactly what happens. I think, in a way, I'm not looking forward to this, but in 2024, if Trump runs again, he's likely to be the Republican nominee. Well, Biden will be 82 years old. That's kind of old to run for president. He'll be
Mhm.
82. He may not run. He may not be able to run. If he doesn't run for president as the Democratic nominee, I can assure you Kamala Harris will be the nominee. I mean,
Mhm.
it'll be irresistible. She's a woman. She's a minority. It'll be Trump versus Kamala Harris. That's a race, frankly, I don't want to see. But it'll be,
Yeah.
and what will determine the outcome between Kamala Harris, who's not particularly popular, and Donald Trump, who's very unpopular, it'll all be determined by one thing: the Biden record. The Biden record so far has been pretty good, just as you said. He's putting money in people's pockets, and a lot of voters are very appreciative of that.
I've heard of a guy that might run if Biden doesn't run again. Obviously, like you said, I agree. Kamala Harris is the standard bearer, but I think there's a guy that could sneak up. It's going to be a tough ride if he does run. But I want to get your opinion on this. Pete Buttigieg.
The nominee will be Kamala Harris. Pete Buttigieg is an attractive candidate. He could very well be a running mate for Kamala Harris, although that would
Hmm.
be a very controversial ticket. But the fact is, uh, when a party can't nominate its most recent president, like if Joe Biden doesn't run, they nominate the vice president. They always do that
But you
because the
don't think
vice
there'll be
president,
a challenge from the left or other people in the party that don't?
yes,
Go ahead.
there will always be a challenge. There's always a challenge, and the vice president always wins the nomination. Walter
Hmm.
Mondale, Richard Nixon in 1960, Hubert Humphrey in 1968, Al Gore in 1980. Vice presidents always get the nomination for one simple reason. One quality makes for a good vice president: loyalty. A vice president is expected to be loyal to the president, and loyalty is rewarded by partisans. Partisans value party loyalty, but once they get the nomination, what happens? They typically lose, because the voters in the country don't value party loyalty. What they value is independence. And a vice president is always someone else's man or woman. Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's man. George Bush was Bill Clinton. I mean, not George Bush. Who was Clinton's vice president? Al Gore was Bill Clinton's man. A vice president is always someone else's person. They're never independent enough to win the election. So vice presidents always win the nomination if they run. I mean, Dan Quayle ran for about 10 minutes and didn't get very far. But if they run seriously, they always get the nomination, and then it's tough to get them elected. Kamala Harris will be the Democratic nominee if Joe Biden doesn't run in 2024.
I'll be praying for Joe Biden to run for re-election then.
Okay.
And last question is on the article that you just wrote that came out today. Can you discuss that, Bill?
I talk about the threat of authoritarianism, which people worry about. And I wrote the article because the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, he warned Americans on January 6th that we could be facing what he called, quote, a Reichstag moment. Now, what did he mean by that? That was the moment in 1933, February 1933, after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, when someone set fire, still not 100% clear who, but it was believed at the time to be a Dutch communist. Someone set fire to the German parliament. And the result was that the Nazis declared a state of emergency. They got rid of the Weimar Democratic Constitution. They outlawed opposition parties, and Germany became a fascist dictatorship for the next 12 years. The general was warning Americans that on January 6th, we were facing was a coup attempt. It was an attempt to overthrow the government and to keep it from doing its constitutional duty, which was to certify the results of the Electoral College. He warned Americans that authoritarianism was creeping in the United States. Now, it didn't happen because no coup in any country has ever succeeded without the support of the military. And the military in the United States refused to intervene, even though Trump expected them to. They refused to intervene because they have a long tradition of keeping out of politics. So they did not intervene. But the threat of authoritarianism is very real in the United States for one simple reason. The radical right has now taken over the Republican Party. He tried to under Goldwater, but Goldwater didn't get elected. Trump did. And that makes a difference because it meant they could succeed. They could win. They've taken over the Republican Party. And in a two-party system, if one of the parties is taken over by extremists, as I believe the Republicans have been, then sooner or later, that party can win. Because when a party is in power, it accumulates enemies and people want change. And if they want change, it could take a long time, but sooner or later, they're going to vote for the opposition party, even if it's too radical. They're going to say, look, we're desperate for change. We have to have something new, something different, and the Republicans could get in. That's why I think the threat of authoritarianism in the United States is quite real.
So what happened in 2016 with Donald Trump winning, and then obviously he was the president until 2021. My question is, he was so incompetent, he couldn't get all these crazy things that the right wing wanted him to get done. But what if you put a competent person in there like Josh Hawley, like Ron DeSantis, that is actually can get these things done that the right wants? That's when it gets really scary. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. There are a lot of very competent people on the right who could implement a right-wing agenda. That is a danger. It's a threat. The title of my article was Authoritarianism. It could definitely happen here. I'm not saying it's about to happen, but it could definitely happen here. And it's a real threat in the United States.
First audience question says, who do you think is the next standard bearer for the Republican Party? Or do you believe that Trump will run again?
No one is sure. Trump is obviously entertaining the idea of running again. And I think my guess is he probably will run again because he's driven by one thing: revenge. He wants revenge on his enemies. He never lets people insult him or criticize him without seeking revenge. His wife talked about that. So I think out of sheer malice and revenge, he will run for president in 2024. He will be challenged. And there are a lot of sensible Republicans who say he'll never win. He's too controversial. He's too divisive. But he will run in 2024. And I think it's pretty likely he'll get the nomination because he has his own private army that can dominate Republican primaries. They're not a majority of the country, but they can easily be a majority of Republican primary voters. Yeah.
Last audience question for you, Bill, is how will Cuba and the events there affect the Florida governor and U.S. Senate race in 2022?
The Cuba situation affects mostly Florida voters. Cubans are no longer even a majority of the Latino vote in Florida because they've had so many more immigrants come from all over the world. But aside from Cubans, you also have Nicaraguans and Venezuelans who are very conservative in Florida, where you are, and who tend to be extraordinarily critical of the Cuban government. And the issues in Cuba are really, they're very localized. It affects Florida politics more than any other part of the country. I don't think most Americans want to get involved in Cuba. I don't think Americans want to send troops. I don't think they want to send troops to Haiti either. In the case of Haiti, the problem is, do we need to send troops in order to prevent a flow of refugees to the United States? But Florida politics is roiled by the politics of the Caribbean. So Cuba is a very meaningful issue there, and it could produce a backlash in Florida. Let me give you a rule that I've always observed in American politics. Any immigrant group that comes from a country that was ruled by communists starts out in the United States voting very right-wing. That includes Cuban Americans who started out voting very Republican. The older Cubans still do. It includes Chinese Americans in the 50s who were very Republican. It includes Korean and Vietnamese Americans who know what communism is all about. The first Korean American member of Congress was a Republican. The first Vietnamese American member of Congress from Louisiana was a Republican. And it even includes Jewish Americans from the Soviet Union. They vote very Republican. In Brighton Beach and in Los Angeles, they're very Republican voters. That effect dies out after a couple of generations. The younger Cubans in Florida, Cuban Americans in Florida, are just like any other immigrant group. They tend to be very democratic. But what's happening is the events in Cuba are roiling Florida politics, and that effect is likely to be felt very profoundly for the next few years.
It just reminds me a lot. I know it was totally a different issue, but what Ilion, did to, obviously 2000 with Gore and Bush.
Oh, yeah, I covered that. I was down there covering the Elian Gonzalez race. And there, most people thought they actually said that he should be sent back to be with his family. Right. It was a remarkable event because while the Cuban Americans were furious that he was not being kept in the United States, most Americans sided with the Clinton administration and they said he belongs with his father, his only living parent. His mother made a terrible sacrifice. He belongs with his father, even though his father was clearly a communist. Politics shouldn't be part of this.
Right. Bill, as we end the interview, where can people find more about you and learn more about you?
Well, I'm now writing for The Hill. Now that I'm retired, I am writing for The Hill every couple of weeks. I'm a contributor to them. I wrote a book, it's now a few years ago. I think it's still available. Oh my God, I can't remember the title of it. But I did a book for Simon & Schuster. And it was published in 2018. So, and I do commentary on, I do commentary on Al Jazeera English, which is not usually available in the United States. But if you want to read what I have to say about things, it would be in The Hill.
Right. And I'm sure if people want to check out the book, you just type your name, Bill Schneider, on Amazon, it'll come up.
It is still remarkably in print after 3 years.
All right, Bill. Hey, thanks so much for your time. This was real insightful, and I hope we can do this again down the road.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. It was my pleasure.